So do we just start?
I think we just do. I think. Hi, Darryl. You can count yourself in. I can count you in. 5, 4, 3.
Hi, Tom.
Hi, Darryl.
I've been told to welcome you to our discussion today, but I don't quite know how to welcome you because you're not here. So, yeah, welcome to my screen. And I've got we had to talk about your excellent book, except now this is probably backwards, right, isn't it?
No, I can see it fine. We've established that things look the way they actually look.
Oh, they're not mirror reversed? Oh,
no, they're not mirror reversed. No.
Okay. Well, your excellent book. And the first question I think I should ask, which I imagine everybody wants to know, is: are you wearing trousers right now?
No, I'm not.
Excellent. So that will be part of the bonus features in the DVD when we sell the DVD version of this conversation.
Although you can also buy short clips of the no trousers for $5.99 a clip. But I don't think Nationale Boeke is handling that. We'll talk about that.
Kindle Shorts, I think they I think we should actually. I need to tell you in advance that we are recording this call for quality purposes. We should actually be doing it on Zoom, I think, because then if Carl loses the recording, we could just ask the Russians for their. Okay, so this. Is it me or is it getting hot in here? Is a book? Would you call it a book of essays? Is it a book of essays around a theme, or is it a single long argument?
I think originally it started as a single long argument, and then after I'd made the argument for about 2 chapters, I realized the argument was done, and so then it became a book of essays. Essays sounds a little bit scholastic, so I've just been saying that it's a collection of thoughts on things.
My next question was, what is an essay? and how does it differ from a column? Like an 800-word column every week. How is writing these fairly long pieces, or as long as you want them to be, or they need to be pieces? How's it different?
The interesting thing was, you and I have both written 800-word columns for many years, and I was well aware of the limitations of that form, but also the benefits of it. That sometimes you can have a very small idea, and then 800 words is fine. Or I can have a very small idea. I don't know if you've ever had a small idea, but I sometimes have very small ideas, and then it's just enough to go.
Just small columnists.
So you'll know that sometimes you've got 2.5 jokes, and it takes a third of the column to get going, and you've got to finish it. So that's fine. But in this book, I discovered that I enjoy writing longer form things. I don't know whether I've so much made arguments in these pieces as just talked and talked and talked. No, I don't want to put myself down, but it certainly felt very comfortable. It felt more like just going for a walk rather than a competitive run. And I think that it was very pleasurable to write these longer pieces. And in many of them, I found that I was making an argument because I'd given myself the time to figure out the argument I was making.
Yeah, did you ever surprise yourself with where the essay ended up taking you, intellectually speaking, or in terms of the conclusion?
I think so. I mean, I think that now and then, there are a couple that didn't make it into the book because I think I talked myself out of them while writing them. I started boldly stating that 1 + 1 was 2, and halfway through I realized I was actually saying 1 + 1 was pork, and it just wasn't working at all. And so some of those landed on the cutting room floor. But yeah, for the most part, I think I've had these ideas, these themes that I've written about really in columns for years, but that I wanted to hash out slightly more fully. In a short form column, you can introduce an idea, but you can't kind of flesh it out, so as well as you might like. So yeah, this book I think was a chance for me to experience what it's like to stretch.
I mean, that can be very, very stressful, because sometimes the good thing about a short column, I find, is that you can stop and it looks like you've got many other things to say if only you had the space, you know.
Yeah.
Whereas you get to, and you do. I mean, it's quite a joy and a treat to be able to go with you as you flesh it all out and live with it for more for longer.
Yeah, as I say, like in some of those that didn't make it into the book, I definitely ran out of steam, intellectually, emotionally. Some of them I realized I just wasn't clever enough to write. You know, some of them I realized that actually I was just that guy at the braai expounding on a topic that really should be left to the experts. and I think I had the good sense to identify those and remove them.
Has that ever happened to you with comments? Because that's happened to me. Where you go, oh, I don't know anything about this. I just because I'm a columnist doesn't mean I actually know this stuff.
Well, I mean, I think you'll find, it depends on what the reader thinks. You'll know that, there are people who love us and who think that our thoughts on anything are lovely and entertaining. And then there are people who hate us a lot and who enjoy the sort of vicious masochistic pain of reading our columns to hate us more. And those people, I think, would insist that I never know anything about anything that I'm writing about. Some of the messages I get are very clear about the fact that I don't know anything about anything. So it's a sense of how bold one feels, and then also like how much, frankly, sort of intellectual humility you have. Ready to? Can you remember? Oh, hang on, I'm not an expert in this field. What can I say that isn't claiming expertise but may contribute to the general conversation?
Well, speaking of anonymous intellectuals on the internet, one of their favorite analogies or figures of speech is always the frog in the boiling pot, right? The boiling, which is quite a central analogy and theme or central idea through your book. Do you wanna talk about it a little?
I do. Right. So there it is. It's on the front cover of the book, so I really should talk about it. So, as anyone watching this will know, you will have heard at some point, we in South Africa are frogs being slowly boiled to death in a pot, and we all know that story where if you turn up the heat on frogs in a pot on a stove, if you decided for some reason to put frogs in a pot, a sort of le creuset on your stove, and then slowly turned up the heat.
If you've run out of frog beer is the next obvious.
Yeah. I was trying to find a joke to make in French, and again, I don't know French, so. But the idea is that the frogs just sort of acclimatize to the rising temperature, and then once it's too late, and they boil to death without really ever getting out of the pot. And this is an analogy that's taken hold of many people's imagination in South Africa, because it seems to be such a perfect analogy for the sort of passive despair that many people feel. Things are just getting worse and worse and worse, and yet here we are. And so I wanted to write about that, because the first thing that I discovered about that some years ago is that it's simply not true. Frogs don't do that. This is all stems, as I explained in the introduction of the book, this stems from physiological experiments done by, I think, a German scientist many centuries ago. And certainly some frogs did passively just allow themselves to boil to death. And that is the story that survived to this day. But they've left out a crucial piece of information, which is that the frogs who boiled to death without getting out of the pot had their brains removed. That was the important part. He had snipped out their little brains. And I must say, I'm not surprised that the frogs didn't try and climb up the pot, not having brains and all. So that struck me as an interesting thing, because apart from the fact that analogy has survived in that form, that's a different story. But it struck me as interesting that we will embrace these very pessimistic, despairing ideas imbuing them with some sort of truth, some sort of scientific truth. I mean, that's a direct appeal to science. Well, frogs do this, and look, it's a science experiment. It must be true, when it's simply not true. And that got me thinking about the way we think about things in this country, the reasons we have the arguments we have, and the positions we take that we're adamant about, our projections, our expectations. So the whole thing kind of this boiling frog went from there, that we absolutely feel things, the pot is fairly hot. Whether or not you see yourself as a frog is another story, but that's not the whole story. And I think this book was an attempt to suggest alternative ways of thinking about the way we think about things without becoming a philosophical, tract.
Yeah, it does seem to always be the case that whenever an analogy or a metaphor is so perfect that you have to use it, it's almost always wrong. And it feels like your book is very much about thinking a little bit more deeply past the obvious phrases that you encounter on the internet or around the bride.
Yeah, and I mean the other one, the obvious one that I write about, I dedicate a chapter to, is politics and sport. And again, many people watching this will have heard, politics must be kept out of sport, and that is presented as an article of faith, or of almost faith and scientific truth. And in that chapter, I investigate that claim, and I hope dismiss it gently. Because of course, international sport is a political activity. It's a political creation. It's fueled by politics. It's a nationalistic pastime. I go into more detail about it, but yeah. So the book is about these sorts of claims that we make and the reasons we make them. And I must just also say, this is all sounding quite serious and earnest. I have tried to be funny in the book.
Yeah, I was about to say, what do you think your percentage? Just for the readers, your percentage of laughs to intelligent to serious thought is one every three sentences, sentence and a half in a hot place.
I would be very happy with 1 to 1.5. I think that's a great ratio.
I know you're a stats man. I would have told you
that. Listen, it's always, I realize, as I said, that I've tried to be funny. That just sounds awful. That's just tragedy right there. So yeah, no, I've tried to keep it light.
Well, it is funny, and in this country, when it's funny and you have been trying to be funny, that's a good thing. As opposed to...
Yes.
Another one of your central themes is about how, I think you put it as there's so much unnecessary pain that South Africans experience because of their expectations of the world, of how the world works, of how politicians work, of how South Africans work.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that? Do you think we should lower our expectations, or should they just be different?
Well, that's an interesting thing. I think there's a profound difference between lowering expectations and just aligning them with reality. Right. So I had this sort of realization a few years back that I was becoming so angry and despondent about the ANC and the mismanagement and wastage of money, theft of money, and I realized that at the center of that sort of anxiety was my belief that the ANC was a political organization, and therefore, as a government, it should be governing. But all the evidence that had been pouring into my eyeballs and ears over decades refuted that. And so the problem wasn't the ANC being a bad government. The problem was me believing that the ANC was a government at all, rather than a patronage machine. And in one of the chapters I describe it as a sort of religious organization. But the analogy I use is it's like going down to the beach and screaming at the sharks in the sea, "Why are you not being better public servants?" Well, that's not what they're there for. That's not why they're there, or that's not their job. And all those projections and expectations were coming from me. So the moment I managed to to realize that that was happening, that my expectations had shifted my perception of reality so dramatically, it started making, the evidence going into my eyeballs and ear holes started making a lot more sense to me. And the pain and anxiety diminished considerably, which is, now when I read about wholesale corruption, I go, oh, okay, that's not a politician doing their job badly. That's a tenderpreneur doing their job well. And you could, you talked about lowering expectations, or and I'm not calling on people to lower expectations. We must still expect our friends to behave in a way that makes us love them, and we must still expect good people to be good. But we really need to stop expecting, a looting machine to be Santa Claus. It's just self-deluding. And again, I've been called cynical, and I don't think I am. I think I still expect the best of the best people, and I still am disappointed when people I thought were better are not. But really and truly, I think our expectations and projections are quite out of whack around especially politics in South Africa.
So what is a reasonable way to respond to the world then that that is still tries to be productive and tries to be civically engaged, and yet doesn't come with the constant burden of anxiety and free floating heartbreak?
I think one of the things I mentioned in the early part of this book is there's an enormous amount, as you say, sort of heartbreak and anxiety, which takes up our attention span. It uses up our bandwidth, essentially. The Twitter fights, the yet another scandal, yet another outrage about something that it's really not that outrageous if you've been paying attention for the last 25 years. And I think my approach is I'm trying to do this, and I would hope that I've expressed this in the book, is to see things for what they are, to clear space on that bandwidth, to give one's attention and one's effort to the positive change, people who can bring about positive change, people who are doing good work. Anyone who reads the media will, whether you are a fan of the media or not, will have realized, why is it that we give so much attention to, small political parties that have, claimed, in the case of the EFF, I make the point in the book, just over 5% of eligible voters in South Africa. Enormous amounts of bandwidth given to that. I haven't read anything about NGOs or human rights lawyers, and it's because it's boring and it's all that sort of thing. But I think that it's essential to sort of start clearing away that clutter, that emotional, psychological clutter that presents itself as important, exciting, dramatic information, but really isn't worth the amount of attention it's demanding.
So, would you then describe your approach, your intellectual approach, and in fact, would you describe your book as being a roadmap to an approach of engagement with? Yeah. How can we both have the same book? Now they're going to know we're in the same room.
No, we're not in the same. We're not. We're
sitting in front of a mirror.
We're in two different places. That's the miracle of the internet. Sorry, you were saying?
We could do it like engagement without outrage is is that how you describe your approach?
I would like to describe my approach as that. I think some might say I'm not quite there yet, given that a lot of my columns come from a place of a sort of outrage. In my defense, I think that some of that might just be me letting off steam, which I think is a healthy response. I feel that outrage is self-harming. It accomplishes almost nothing. It certainly doesn't shift the targets of whatever the outrage is directed at. It feels upsetting and awful. And in the book, there's a chapter called Laughing While Rome Burns, in which I talk about kind of what I do and what satirists and humorists do in terms of making funny jokes about terrible things. And, should we, what's it for? And the point I make, and I know this will upset certain sort of activist comics and satirists, is comedy, humor, satire doesn't change power structures. It never has, ever. It entertains, it allows one to feel that things might shift, but regimes have never been toppled by satirists. It's always huge events. It's economics, it's climate change, it's violent uprising. So for me, the point of making jokes about terrible things is not the hope that my words will change them, because I don't really think they will. But it is a form of self-care. People often say, "Oh, I laughed. I read a funny thing." I don't know about you, but I very seldom laugh out loud
No.
at a funny thing. Like almost never. But what I do,
always felt gaslit by that LOL.
Yeah.
It's not just a generation thing. I think it's and why is everyone else laughing out loud all the time? Yeah.
Very little makes me laugh out loud, other than very, very facile sort of slapstick. But what I do when I read something sharp and satirically, pertinent and good, is I sort of do that thing that I think many of us do, which is a slight snort out of the nose, sort of a. It's definitely not a laugh, but I do feel, I can't help but feel that that's what it sounds like when we let off steam. It is definitely an exhalation of something bad leaving us. And I think, that might sound a bit frou, but I think it's true. I think that laughing at bad things, or again, laughing, quote unquote, exhaling sharply over bad things, is a form of self-care. And I think that is what I would like my intellectual position to be, where, as you say, engagement without outrage. And maybe that engagement can be firm exhalation through both nostrils.
Do you still consider yourself a satirist? Is what you do satire, or?
I don't know. I don't know. I used to think that I was a satirist. People called me a satirist, so I called myself a satirist. Peter Dirk Ace was a satirist. I'm not sure you can be a satirist and not be in danger.
Well,
do you know what I mean? Like Peter Dirk Ace, okay, he wasn't ever going to be flung into solitary confinement, because that would have been too big a leap for the security police. But it was still dangerous to be a satirist in the 1980s. It was, certainly he was harassed a great deal, and he was brave in what he did. But I think for myself, I've never been threatened. I've never been, spied on or roughed up or anything like that. The closest I've ever come to any kind of backlash was Louis Late many years ago. At highboard.com, we wrote some article mentioning Louis Late, and there was a rumble from his legal team briefly that went away. So I'm not really sure you can call yourself a satirist if you've never been in any real danger. I don't know if that's too self-deprecating.
With exquisite timing, you finished your book and submitted it just before COVID, didn't you?
I did. It was. Would it have changed much? No, because I think one only figures out what really happened, many months or even years after the fact. And so I don't think we know where we are currently. I took a bit of a flyer in my preface and assumed that South Africa would still be South Africa. I finished writing this in sort of January. I got the page proofs the day before lockdown in late March. which meant I did have some weeks to update things slightly, but not make material changes. And I think no, I really wouldn't have changed very much, because as it turned out, South Africa remains South Africa. The state operates in some ways that seem briefly sensible and pragmatic, and then it all goes to hell. Beki Cele is still Beki Cele. The arguments we're having online, are still the same arguments we're having online. The only thing I wish I could have put in more of was, in the early weeks of COVID, this 5G conspiracy theory, the Bill Gates microchip 5G theory, which I have a chapter about fake news and conspiracy theory, and I would have liked to have mentioned that more, but otherwise, no, I think I said what I wanted to say, and I'm not really sure what one can say about COVID that hasn't already been said, and far better by experts.
Would it have been easier to have written your book during lockdown or before?
No, it would. I wouldn't have been able to
anything during
lockdown. Lockdown was just sort of shut down as well. I couldn't have written it during lockdown. I think priorities change, energies changed. I found lockdown simultaneously, or heavy lockdown, level 5, 4. I found it simultaneously very stressful and supremely relaxing. With the result that I ended up doing nothing, because the stress sort of paralyzed me, and then the very relaxing aspect made me not want to do anything either. So, I'm very grateful. It all worked out nicely that I'd finished it just in time.
I found it quite gratifying to think that no one else was having a good time either. In the world, no one was having a better time than me. It was like the first time in my life I felt it.
Yeah. I must say, I'm very grateful that, the timing worked out quite nicely, that this book actually is having a little, online launch with you, and that there's a little fuss made of it, because in the first weeks of lockdown, books just disappeared into the ether. Authors published their babies that had been a year or two in the making, and they just vanished without a trace, as everyone was trying to figure out how life worked and what it all meant. So I really feel for those people, and I'm very grateful that at least we've sort of settled into a strange, anxious new normal. Oh God, I said new normal, but you know what I mean.
I do. Do you consider yourself personally, if it were a continuum, which it is, more optimistic or more pessimistic?
Yes. Yes. I think I'm fundamentally, I don't know. I think really both. You and I both enjoy reading about history, and because of that, you realize that it's always terrible. It's always been the worst, and then we've gone on, and something wonderful has followed the something terrible, and then there's a something terrible that follows the something wonderful. So, this I do get a bit eye-rolly at people who say, it's never been worse than right now. And then I do have quite a strong urge to say, well, okay, well then you go to the 1300s with a toothache and see how you manage. But I think if one can hold the complexity of optimism and pessimism, I think,
we just about out of time. But we've been receiving some questions from the viewers. So just a few quick ones to go through there. So we've got from Cheryl in Somerset West. Where do you get your ideas from?
From the news. They always come from the news. From this book, they came from many years of the news.
Mm-hmm. Marlon in Beaufort East. Well, this is more of a statement than a question. Card Bristow died in 1642. I suppose
that's fair.
It's a matter of opinion, Marlon. Are you thinking about another book? Are you writing another book?
Not currently. I am definitely thinking about another book. I have a novel that's been simmering for about a decade now, and
like a frog in a pot of water.
exactly like a frog in a pot of water. Although this one still has a brain and may clamber out of the pot of water and go somewhere.
Who would play you in the movie of your life?
Oh God. You see, I'm grateful for that because I don't know what genre of the movie of my life is. I don't know if it's romantic comedy or action adventure or kind of French art house where I just gaze off to one side for a long, long time. I don't know. I don't know who would play me in the movie of my life.
Yeah, that's fun. Do you have any nicknames? Is what Douglas in Eisner wants to know.
One or two people insist on calling me Chucky because of my bowling action. Apparently, allegedly, I flex my elbow when I deliver the ball. I think that is incredibly rude to allege, and it's simply not true. It's a congenital deformation of the. I actually know this word. It's the. I used to know.
It's the Muralitharan tendon.
That's it. No, it's a bone. It's a bone that goes through the elbow. Can't straighten the elbow. I mean, I can, but he can't.
Do you have any hidden talents that your audience do not know about but would like to?
I don't know if they'd like to know about it, but I can play music on my cheeks.
Is there something you'd like to demonstrate?
I don't know if you'll be able to hear it. I also entertain babies by making water drop sounds like this. And babies love that a lot.
Not babies, I love that.
Yeah, so I won't play the music, but the baby cheek dropper, that's a skill that I have.
Tom, I think regrettably our time's up. I see Carl making frantic. I can't. I'm pretending I can see Carl making frantic waving gestures at me. This has been really great. Do you remember at the beginning of lockdown when everybody thought, oh, it's going to be so much fun to socialize on Zoom and we're all going to have parties and everything, and that was like literally the worst thing in the world. But this was fun.
This was fun. And I recently read a headline, because that's all anyone does anymore is read headlines. Yeah. I read a headline saying, why we wave goodbye at the end of Zoom meetings. I don't know why we do, but we do, because I didn't read the article. So I'm going to wave goodbye to you and everyone.
Like little Taurus Rexes.
Exactly. And yeah, there we go. And thank you very much. This was a lot of fun. And thank you for being here, as it were.
I recommend your book, Tom, and I commend it to all of the people out there that they should. Yeah, that's the one. That they should. My one looks back to front, and that they should go and buy it and read it. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you.